Course 103, Rural Society and Polity in India, Unit 5, Rural Social Transformation in Contemporary Times. This Unit 5 will focus on some of the key contemporary changes in the rural fabric, the current trajectory of agriculture in rural India, what are the challenges to it, the changing shape of rural aspirations, what form are these taking, and also look at some of the key challenges that rural India faces in education and health, in WASH. These changes, these challenges are important to know because they have bearings for rural development. The Unit 5 will include 4 lessons. Lesson 1 will be on challenges to agriculture. Lesson 2 will be on education and health. Lesson 3 on water, sanitation, hygiene, that is WASH. And Lesson 4 will look at rural aspirations and consumerism. Lesson 1 on challenges to agriculture. The objective of Lesson 1 is to understand the current scenario of rural agriculture sector and primarily what are the challenges that it faces. The structure for the lesson will be as following. We will first have an overview of the changing trajectory of agriculture in rural India. Then we will move on to address the challenges and look at commercialization of agriculture, dependence on monsoon and inadequate irrigation, the issue of small and fragmented land holdings, lack of protective policies and lack of marketing and storage facilities, also the inadequate access to institutional credit, diversion of agricultural land to non-agricultural land use, privatization and increased costs, also look at rural-urban divide and other exogenous or external factors and shocks like droughts, floods and other calamities. We will then move on to have a look at the impacts that the challenges of agriculture create. So, impacts on farmers, suicides, also the phenomenon of dispossession and depeasantization, and we will also look at the impact it may have specifically for women. So, to begin with an overview of the agriculture sector and its role in the rural economy. So, if you look at the table that is given here, it depicts the share of rural areas in the total net domestic product of India and also in the workforce of India across different sectors, and it gives these figures in percentage for the period 1970-71 up to 2011-12. What we see here is that agriculture's share is very significant to net domestic product and also to employment, and it has been steady and consistent over the years. Now, if we look at the net domestic product of just rural areas, in the first table, we see the sectoral share in percent over the time frames 1970-71 to 2011-12. Here also, we see that the share of agriculture is maximum. If we also look at closely the 2011-12 figures. But although the share of agriculture has been significant and it is maximum, we see that there has been a decline over the years. The second table depicts employment in rural areas and the sectoral share to employment in rural areas given in percent again over the same time frame. If we look at the sectors and the share in rural employment, again the share of agriculture is maximum. Again here too, although the share of agriculture is maximum, it has been declining over the years. So, though agriculture has been a mainstay of rural economy, it's facing a decline in its contribution over the years. Over the years, dependency of rural households on agriculture has declined to nearly about 50%, as is reported by the Periodic Labour Force Survey for 2008-18-19. There has also been a shift in the occupational choice among rural workers, particularly rural agricultural workers. There is a change in choice from agriculture to non-agriculture sectors. If we look at gender-wise employment, the percentage of male workers engaged in agricultural activities has seen a decline from 78% in 1983 to about 53% in 2018. And for the same time period, if we look at rate of female agricultural employment, this also fell from 88% to 71%. On the other hand, workforce participation in rural non-agricultural sectors has increased. For male workers, this has increased from 22% in 1983 to 47% in 2018. And female employment in the rural non-agricultural sector has increased from 12% to 29%. What are the challenges and factors that influence these changes and this kind of trend of that we see of decline in the contribution of the agriculture sector? The key challenges that agriculture faces can be listed as commercialization of agriculture, dependence on monsoon and inadequate irrigation, the incidence of small and fragmented land holdings, a lack of protective policies and also facilities for marketing and storage, inadequate access to institutional credit, diversion of agricultural land to non-agricultural land use, privatization and increased costs, also the rural-urban divide and other shocks like droughts, floods, cyclones, etc. We will look at each one of these. Commercialization of agriculture. An agricultural practice is called commercialized when the primary purpose of cultivation is not to grow for self-consumption or for self-sustenance, but it is to sell in the market and to make profit. In India, commercialization of agriculture took place for food grains, and soon after other non-food grain cash crops were also cultivated for profit generation. After 1990s, cultivation of more and more cash crops, be it sugarcane, cotton, soybean and others, has increased. The cash or the commercial crops give more cash or profit in return, but the input cost is higher. In addition to the higher input cost, they also need more water. In several places where there is not enough surface water for cultivation, farmers who grow cash crops end up digging deep for bore wells and extract groundwater. So all of this adds to a farmer's cost of production, but they are driven by the thinking that the market return would compensate for the high input cost. Dependence on monsoon and inadequate irrigation. In India, most of the agricultural areas are rain-fed and they are largely dependent on the monsoon. If the monsoon fails, crops collapse. Monsoon remains crucial for the overall growth in the agricultural sector. A bad monsoon impacts the cost of cultivation, and in India, rainfall is uncertain and unreliable and erratic. In such a scenario, irrigation becomes probably the most important agricultural input. Although India is among the largest irrigated countries in the world, less than 50% of its total sown area is irrigated. Both surface and groundwater are used for irrigation, and in rural areas, about 40% of irrigation water is from groundwater. Small and fragmented land holdings. There is also the problem of decreasing size of land holding. A very high percentage of cultivators in India are essentially small and marginal landholders. The average size of land holding in India reduced from around 2.3 hectares in 1970-71 to about 1.32 hectares in 2001, and it is estimated to decrease to 0.32 hectares in 2030. And the same can also be corroborated with yet another fact, like when we look at the number of small and marginal agricultural land holdings, which has increased from 2010-11 to even 2015-16. Profitability also becomes difficult, especially when looked at in comparison with the input costs. Access to irrigation and investing high costs in small land holdings becomes a challenge, as also profitability. Lack of protective policies and investment, or rather a political and regulatory ecosystem. There has been a paucity of fresh investments in the agriculture sector, and there are both political and economic reasons for this. India has focused more on its industrial development than on agricultural development, specifically on bringing structural development in the agricultural sector. And combined with this, there's also a lack of storage facilities and marketing facilities. So farmers depend upon local traders and middlemen for market. When they do not get good market prices, farmers face losses, and many of them also fall into debt. Storage facilities in rural areas are inadequate. Agricultural products cannot be stored for long durations. So farmers are forced to sell their products immediately after the harvest, and they then tend to sell at the prevailing market prices with greater losses. Post-harvest losses occur largely due to poor storage conditions. Therefore, scientific storage is necessary, and it's essential to avoid losses to benefit farmers and also to benefit consumers. Inadequate access to institutional credit. Availability of credit facility to farmers at a reasonable rate is another important factor. Most of the farmers, especially the small and marginal farmers, may not be able to avail loans from mainstream banks. There are also cooperative banks for farmers' needs, but these are few. Farmers therefore turn to money lenders for getting a loan, and getting a loan in time so that they can invest in their crop production. The interest rate in the case of individual private money lenders is very, very high. Let us have a look at the table that is given here. The table depicts profit per acre to farmers for food as well as non-food items in the case of without credit and also in the case of with credit, and this is given as per the land size. Different land holding categories. So, less than 1 acre, 1 to 2 acres, 2 to 3 acres, and more than 3 acres. So, if we look at the figures of profit per acre for non-food. So, if for a farmer without credit, the profit stands at 42,500, whereas the same, if credit is provided, can stand at 73,500. If we look at food grains, here without credit the profit per acre could be 4,000, whereas when credit is provided it could be 5,900. So, overall profitability per acre rises with of course the size of land holdings, but access to credit can compensate for the size of the land holding, and it can raise profitability by up to nearly 50%. With access to credit, farmers with smaller land holdings can also have good profitability. Diversion of agricultural land for non-agricultural purposes or land use. In India, as per policy, prime farmland must be conserved and used for agriculture except under certain circumstances. Where there is a conversion or change, there should be compensation, and the agencies, whether government or private, that are bringing about the change in land use are supposed to provide compensation to the landowners. As far as possible, land with low farming yields or land that was not farmable is what should be marked for non-agricultural purposes. But over the years, agricultural land use has been converted to different kinds of non-agricultural land use, like for industrial purposes, for other commercial purposes, for the creation of special economic zones, for public infrastructure projects and provisions and facilities, also for big development projects. Although the compensation may be given in all these cases, but in the long run, the conversion may be detrimental for individual farmers and also reduces availability overall of productive agricultural land. Privatization and increased costs. Overall in India, there is an increased privatization, especially in the education and health sectors. This has also made inroads into rural life. People in rural areas also prefer to send their children to private English medium schools, as government schools are deemed to be of poorer quality. Similarly, poor quality facility and services in government hospitals also makes people opt for private medical facilities. Studies have pointed out that in rural areas, taking loans has also from, again, individual or private money lenders has also started occurring for the purpose of healthcare. Most of the farmers in India are small and medium farmers, as we have learned. Many of them struggle to survive even while they supply food to the rest of the country. And all of this increased privatization also adds to the cost of living of the already impoverished farmers and agricultural households. Rural-urban divide. In India, there has been an increasing rural-urban gap. For example, the rural monthly per capita expenditure grew from 0.8% between 93-94 and 2004-5, and it grew much faster at 3.3% between 2004-5 and 2011-12. But the growth rate of urban incomes when compared to this has been much faster, and the difference between rural and urban consumption has also increased a lot over this period. Despite growth in rural incomes and a progressive change, there has also been a disillusionment with farming. A survey that was conducted in 2014 showed that around 40% of farmers were dissatisfied with their economic condition, and more than 70% farmers thought city life was better than village life. Exogenous shocks. Exogenous shocks such as frequent droughts, floods, cyclones are also responsible for falling employment share in the agriculture sector. These calamities cause extensive damage to crops, and in turn they act as a deterrent for rural workforce to take up farming. Let's take the example of floods. The Indian agricultural sector remains highly vulnerable to frequent flood disasters. During the years 1980 to 2017, on an average, India lost around 2,785 crore annually due to crop damage from flooding. Frequent floods not only affect agricultural employment, but they also increase farmer distress. Damages due to floods result in a decline in the economic growth of states. Lower economic growth then in turn affects agricultural employment and income of rural households. The damage due to floods also affects gender-wise employment in the rural agricultural sector. So agriculture is a major employment provider for female rural workforce. Any calamities like floods result in a reduction in income and employment opportunities for the rural female workforce as well. So with all these challenges, what are the impacts that occur? Impacts for those who are dependent on agriculture. We look at three impacts: farmer suicides, the phenomenon of dispossession and also of depeasantization, and the impact on women in agriculture. Farmer suicides. The surge in input costs acts as an increased burden on farmers. Inflated agricultural input prices have been a major cause of farmer suicides in India. The cost of fertilizers, crop protection chemicals, seeds, and input costs are not confined just to the basic raw materials. Using machinery and equipment such as tractors, submersible pumps and other such items also adds to the high costs. The input costs actually become more expensive for small and marginal farmers. There are also labor costs. Hiring labor is also becoming more expensive. There's also lack of awareness because farmers are unable to take advantage of the benefits of government policies and schemes due to the digital divide and literacy gap. Marginal and small farmers are particularly vulnerable. There's also a water issue. The concentration of farmer suicides has been seen to be in water scarce areas. In states like Maharashtra, Karnataka, the water crisis and failure to meet production has increased the threat of farmer suicides, and this is especially true when there is failure of monsoons. Due to such high input costs, farmers are forced to take loans and large loans in order to cultivate their crops, and they are unable to repay the loans and suffer losses and do not have profitability. Between 2013 and 2019, figures show that farmers' income rose by 30%, while their debt surged around 58%. So farmers' debt as a percentage of their annual income increased by 13%. Farmer suicides have been occurring as a phenomenon since 1970s, and it is reported that 2,96,438 Indian farmers have committed suicide since 1995. Out of these, more than 60,000 were in the state of Maharashtra. The Marathwada and Vidarbha regions in Maharashtra have particularly recorded very high numbers of farmer suicides. Other states are Odisha, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat and Chhattisgarh. In India, farmer suicides account for 11.2% of all suicides, and the data on suicides is collected by and also published by the National Crime Records Bureau. So farmer suicides are an extremely unfortunate result of the agrarian distress which is being faced in the rural economy. Data and studies clearly draw a relationship between farmer suicides and issues like increasing debt burdens, monsoon failure, water shortage, absence of social security and robust crop procurement facilities. Let us delve into this a little more by taking one case or instance from the Rayalaseema region of Andhra Pradesh. This has been taken from the People's Archive of Rural India. Here, farmers growing tomato. The rainfall has been quite unpredictable in Andhra Pradesh's Rayalaseema region, which is drought prone, and farmers have spent a lot on bore wells to cultivate even their small land holdings. In 2019, the average household debt of farmers in the state of Andhra Pradesh was the highest in the country, and it stood at 2.45 lakhs average per household. In 2019 again, 93% agricultural households in the state of Andhra Pradesh were in debt. Borewell failure is one of the top reasons that has been noted amongst others being failure of tomato crop, agricultural debt, and these have been noted in the police records as factors and reasons for farmer suicides. In July 2020, a 33-year-old farmer died by suicide. He had a debt of 8.35 lakhs. The tomatoes that he had been cultivating in half an acre of his land had remained unplugged and were not sold. Most of the debt that he had taken was to make expenses on 4 bore wells, which he had dug over a period of 8 years and to go as deep as nearly 700 to 800 feet. And interest had grown on the borrowed amount. So the total sum had actually grown by leaps in this entire period of 8 years. After his death, to pay back some part of the loan, his family sold 2 acres of land, and they are now cultivating paddy on half an acre, drawing water from a bore well which is used by other families as well in the area. Farmers' deaths by suicide have shot up in Chittoor since 2019. In 2020, when Andhra Pradesh recorded the 3rd highest number of farmer suicides in the country, 564. According to the National Crime Records Bureau, 34 were from Chittoor itself. In 2019-20, Chittoor contributed to 37% to the state's share of tomato production. Andhra Pradesh was the 2nd largest producer in India that year. The Madanpalle tomato market, which is one of the largest market yards in the country, many tomato growers in Chittoor and other districts of Rayalaseema actually sell their produce here. Here, the wholesale prices are decided by auction and the rate depends on several factors. If there is rain the night before, prices will come down next morning, and when the prices are good, then naturally there will be more produce that comes into the market, which in turn can make the rate drop down. Although the input costs have increased many folds in the last several years and decades, the potential of high returns on tomato crop actually has been attracting cultivators to take it up. Dispossession and depeasantization. Depeasantization. Farming is no more an attractive option for traditional rural farming communities, as it may not give them an income as they desire. At the same time, there are other non-farm sector jobs that are opening up. There is also preference to migrate and find alternative work in cities. This entire process can be called depeasantization. It's seen more in the case of small farmers and marginal farmers, and also in the case of marginalized communities like scheduled castes, scheduled tribes and other backward classes. Because of the small size of land holdings and the increased cost of production, small farmers can no more derive livelihood from agricultural activities, and they migrate therefore in search of wage labor and other alternatives. Dispossession means being forced to leave agricultural land when there is a change in land use. Various development activities such as dams, mining, industrialization, even urbanization or creation of special economic zones for government or by private players, such an activity forces the rural community living there to move out, and they are displaced. So, for example, when special economic zones are to be established to promote industrial and commercial activities, a lot of land is needed, and farmlands could become easy targeted areas. In such cases, farmers are forced to sell their lands and become dispossessed. The compensation that they get might be sufficient in the short run, but it is not adequate to give them an alternative livelihood option in the long run. The impact on women in agriculture. So, in general popular imagination, a farmer is usually equated to be a man, even though women play a very significant role in agriculture. They perform various farming activities. Therefore, women also face the brunt of the crisis in agriculture. Rather, for women, it becomes even harder. How? They have to manage the house within the falling economic condition. When the male head dies by suicide, the wife has to struggle to make ends meet. There are also cases of women farmer suicides. When a woman farmer dies by suicide, it is often not recognized as a farmer's death by suicide, because land record is usually not in the name of the women, and when a woman farmer dies by suicide, it is not therefore likely recorded as farmer's suicide. Let us have a look at this figure. It depicts farmer's suicide by gender. The reference here is 2015. Cases of suicide of male farmers are depicted in the color blue, whereas for female farmer suicides, it's depicted in red. So, we do see that there are several cases of female farmer suicides, and then the figures depicted here stand at 2,372 for female farmers and 13,000 plus for male farmers. While agriculture's share in India's economy and also rural economy has declined over time, also due to the high growth rate of industrial and service sectors, yet the sector's importance remains. India is a global agricultural powerhouse. It's the world's largest producer of milk, pulses, spices. It's also the world's largest cattle herd of buffaloes, as well as it has the largest area under wheat, rice and cotton. India is also the second largest producer of rice, wheat, cotton, sugarcane, farmed fish, fruit, vegetables, tea. Moreover, India's food security depends on agriculture sector, producing cereal crops, production of fruits, vegetables to meet the demands of a growing population with rising incomes. And to be able to continue to do so, it is important for the agricultural sector to remain productive, competitive, diversified and sustainable. And for that to happen, public agricultural input subsidies can be made readily available, and also increasing minimum support price for agricultural crops is crucial. I conclude the lesson with an activity for you to do. In your view, what support can be given to the agriculture sector in rural India? What are the interventions that can be undertaken so that agriculture continues to be relevant? One, to the rural economy, and second, to the individual farmer or household. Write a small note. Thank you.